Okay, oh, I see it over there. Okay. Okay, so very thrilled, very excited to do this. This is a call out to the class. Of course, this is a little different, this format, and we're hoping it works. For this section, this segment, if you like. I don't like section because it cuts things off, right? Put boundaries around what we're talking about. But this particular section, I said it again, segment. I've also done a video in the park, and we can talk about that also. So things are a little bit changed up a little bit. And so we hope that recording this format, it will get to you. So I am very excited to have a conversation here, and have the privilege of being in conversation in relation to our material for this segment with my very good friend and colleague, Nichole Leveck. And what I will do is, and I don't like to, I'm always uncomfortable with introducing people, so what I will do is I'm going to introduce, and Nichole is of course a current equity studies comrade as well. So I'm going to allow Nichole to introduce herself, right? So Nichole, would you?
Bonjour, everyone. My name's Nichole. I'm traditionally from the city. I'm a First Nation woman. Also, I wasn't raised with my mother, so I'm not too sure my ancestry in that way, but I was also raised with a Scottish family. I am a fancy shawl dancer, have for many, many years, involved in our community here in Toronto, and of course, a very proud equity studies student. Just as I'm sure all of you are, so and I'm very happy to be here today. It's a good day.
Wonderful. So, we talked about just having a conversation wrapped around this material. There's so many things going on in the piece of material that we have. We have the video by ABC News on Jane Elliott, coming from 1970, and Jane Elliott's classroom there. Jane Elliott ran out of town after that video by white supremacy. And then we have the two pieces by Shireen Razak, talking about race and place and space. Then taking that up in relation to the murder of Pamela George. And then we have the piece by Dara Culhane, Regimes of Disappearance, and then the short film by Jennifer Hodge da Silva, African-Canadian film director, filmmaker, on Jane and Finch, the Jane and Finch area in 1983, right? And I put that in because we're talking also about voice, right, and the reclamation of voice, and statements such as that and expressions of voice such as that are constantly disappeared, right? To take Culhane's concept and the way Culhane uses that disappearance, regimes of disappearance, and how we are disappeared, right? And the multiple ways in which we are disappeared into the point where we're not even conscious of them, right? And so a lot of our material is very much connected to that in terms of what that looks like in terms of also policing movements, etc., right? And bodies, speaking of bodies and speaking about how bodies matter, right? A lot of talk about bodies. I think many folks are familiar now, particularly within academia, about bodies that matter, right? And bodies mattering, right? But there's also, of course, and how bodies matter and how embodiment itself, right? And how much the emphasis it should be placed upon our embodiment and how what is being written onto our bodies, right? And who is doing that writing, right? But also at the same time that there is a matter to bodies, right? Which I was trying to speak to in relation to, my lecture before in the park, right? Oriel Park, or as I wanted, I claim it as Byron de Batagay's Memorial Park, right? As a matter, two bodies, which I think, for me, that also came up in your talk, conversations last night, Nichole, when we speak about the connections with bodies and land, right?
Yep.
It's not a question of connections with bodies being on land. It's a question of bodies being inland and land being in bodies, right? Right. Otherwise, how do we understand the memories that land has and holds that is also in our embodiment, right? If we don't think along those particular lines, how on earth, how can we possibly, as you rightly said last night, take up space, right? Anti-colonial space, right? Demand space, right? Demand recognition. So I'd like to take, you have been through that material, and I'd like to also then have a conversation, take up some of your thoughts on this material, right? And the kind of discussion, the kind of thinking that's going around there, right? And I think for me, it is better to do this rather than take up, do this PowerPoint presentations and say, this is so-and-so, Razak is talking about this concept, and then we must know that concept, et cetera, et cetera. We speak about how these stories live in us, right? Right? And sometimes we take them in different directions and we expand upon them. And sometimes there's like 90% maybe we can take, 10% we can take, or 90% we can reject, right? 10% we can take, right? And that's how, I think we need to be thinking about our presence in the world in relation to as individuals and as collectives. So, which we're forced to forget oftentimes, right? This course is about self-defense, right? So all of this thinking, right, is about defending ourselves, right? How we defend ourselves physically, psychologically, emotionally, right? Spiritually, right? As individuals, but also as individuals that are members of collectives. And when we say collectives, and you last night, Nichole, both you and Ellen Gabriel, right? The elder, Ellen Gabriel, incredible activist and elder and warrior at, again, at the Sagi Oka crisis standoff in 1990, which our students will know about because we have material aligned to that. Understood, right, that of those connections, right, taking up space also is a question of then rethinking, right, how we come to be and where we are going, right, with if we think about connectedness with all of our relations, right, alongside of all our relations and bringing all of our relations into this process, this practice of self-defense, right? Because we're defending all of that, right? So if they're teaching us how to think, right, we've somehow how to reject all that, then to oppose that is self-defense on the part of all of our collectives, all of our relations, right? So then we take up space using anti-colonial conceptual ways of thinking about where we come from and where we're going and where we are right now, right? So I'll throw that pass that over to you and your thoughts.
I loved it, Kistan. As you know, what am I in my 4th year now of my equity studies? I'm almost ready to graduate. So just the act of, say, reading Razak's piece and understanding what it means that space, racist space, right? And understanding what that means at that level, to now come back and read again. And this is why it's important for equity students, the further that we go along, to come back to these readings again and again, because we get a new story told to us in a new way, but that is of the same. So it's that bringing back. And one of the things that I loved about it, especially in this, I'll start with this piece, is when it's on the first page and it's talking about how they use the term Aboriginal people are presumed to be the mostly dead or assimilated.
Yes.
And I thought about how that's a telling of a story. That is that colonial story. And then our remembering our ancestry, our land, is that act, as you said, of that self-defense. So I thought, you know, sometimes I forget about that because, as a First Nation woman, I'm more in the thing of trying to get our stories heard.
Yes, yes.
To then realize, oh wait, no, we're actually fighting an already pre-narrative that's actually done beforehand.
Yes.
And so that assimilation is like I wrote on here on the notes when I read them again, that it's like almost like a foretelling of, because the assimilation in the colonial eyes is not done. It's not finished. We're still fighting. So yes. to have that on there, it's like they're trying to tell a story as though it's already true, you know? And then to have that fight back and that pushback, and saying, I love how you bring that, because like Baron's story, it's so, without that remembering, it's like it's washed away, you know? And for that, our future generations, what does that mean? You know, so that act of just going to the park and sitting there and remembering and recalling that, as we know, the land feels you, the trees, everything, it hears, because the land is there when that atrocity happened to Baron.
And we're told by this dominant culture, right? You know, dominant systems of power, this colonial, you know, way of thinking, way of knowing, that somehow to draw upon that as knowledge, right? And as a conceptual framework, right? A conceptual in terms of how we understand it, the framework of way of knowing and doing, and you know, it's somehow, you know, we're literally told it's somehow primitive, right? And our bodies say, wait a minute, how can I think about that? You know, and yet those are our ancestors in us, right?
Yeah.
Right? You know, that's how we come to be, right? Because of that knowledge, as a result of that knowledge. And yet we consistently, for me, I find myself second guessing, right? Yeah. Somehow I find myself not, even how the times that I have been on this planet, right? The length of time I've been on this planet, you know, hopefully many more years, but I've been on this planet enough time now, long enough now, right? To perhaps be, you know, being able to defend myself against that and reject that. But parts of my body have internalized this colonial thinking so much that even when I begin to have that relationship with everything around me, you know, and listen to trees singing and talk about those who have been taken from us, right? As also now going back into land and becoming part of the memories of trees, right? You know, yeah. And trees themselves have the memory of what happened in that particular park, right? Somehow a little part of me says that I can feel it saying, you know, that's not real legitimate knowledge, right? You know, and yet it's in me, and I know it is in me, even though my ancestors go back many years in relation to my Kalinago peoples, but African ancestry peoples in relation to indigeneity. Also, you know, even in European sense, right? You know, there's an indigenous knowledge that was wiped out, right? In terms of our relationships to land and everything around it, animal life, right? Trees, etc. You know, and when I read, and so there's always that struggle there. I guess where I'm going there is that remembering, become conscious that, wait a minute, I continuously have to defend myself, right? You know, yeah. The rejection of that is self-defense, right? You know, to take up that space and to demand recognition of that theoretical space, right? That cultural space, right? Is self-defense, right? And is a fight back, right? And it's crucial to our survival, you know.
I love how you brought in that part of yourself that says, no, this isn't real. We have to defend ourselves against that voice in our head, because that's the colonial voice. So even that, like when you say constantly defend, it's in our own sight because it's placed. Oh.
And I think, you know, this is where I think, you know, Shireen Razak's piece is useful in this sense in talking about space in that sense, right? Because oftentimes we talk about, you know, physical space, right? And oftentimes, you know, we talk about physical space, and yes, when we talk about dominance also, and what Shireen talks about is pushing us in terms of the imagination, the psyche of dominance, pushing it into this kind of spaces of, you know, criminalization, right? Terrorism, you know, immorality, right? You know, savagery, etc., right? You know, and so where, you know, and as I say, I think there's importance to that, because then you begin to, it allows you then to begin to think about, okay, so this is something that is not natural. You know, my lived experience, you know, I've been demoralized in situations where, and you may, you know, maybe you can speak to this, Nichole, also. I've been demoralized in situations where I've forgotten that my own conditions, right, is a colonial, has been imposed by colonial power, right? So I've forgotten in circumstances, where, for example, where in moments of poverty, and we talk about poverty as bringing all those anxieties that come with it, right? A gripping of fear, right? And then that demoralization, helplessness, right? Where we open up a cupboard and we see fucking God knows how many roaches coming out, and it is just coming down. It is just debilitating, right? I remember, you know, our little cat, right? We put down roach powder all over the place, right? And our little cat, you know, I think we'd had for 20 years, loved, right? You know, in our little apartment, right? You know, going over the years at times, struggling with eviction notices, etc. And our cat licked up that stuff, right? I believe our cat died after that. I put that powder down because we were desperate. Roaches everywhere, right? And it just brought us down, and we forgot the political because we were so demoralized by everything, and somehow we wanted to escape this, and this was our plight, right? And that made us helpless and made us hopeless. And even if I can go after that and start going into a classroom as a precarious worker and talk about equity, you know, I'm not taking that back to, it's a lesson. I'm not taking it back to when I return and I see our cat that's died, right? And then the roaches are still there. And then the building people, these slumlords, are demanding more money. And if I become conscious then that that is politically imposed, right? There's an agenda to curtail my and our movement, right? There's an agenda on the part of colonial power. In fact, there's an imperative, right? Movement in terms of the physical, movement in terms of the psychological, the spiritual. If I can think about that and make that political, become conscious of that, then I start to create possibilities of political resistance. I'm not hopeless, I'm less helpless, I'm less demoralized. I don't know, I want to take my life out of this place, right? I'm less predisposed to that, and I'm more predisposed to fight, right? Fight back.
Because that is the, you know, I'll just speak a little bit about my personal heart condition, if that's okay, because it's a great teacher. So I have a pacemaker for a low heart rate. I have a low resting heart rate. So we have two tones of our heart, the vasovagal, which is the fight or flight, that gets our blood pumping, and we know our hands start feeling heavy, ready to fight, and the blood feels to our feet, so to run. So whether you're running or you're fighting, the vasovagal is the calm, peaceful state, which allows us to grow, be healthy, all of those things. So with this constant fight or flight being now put on, like you say, not only the only breathing space you get to have out of that is in your classroom, but you're now working, you know, and you're putting that there, and you have to leave that behind in that way. So you're in this, so it's this constant fight or flight. Now, no room for growth, you know, by the end of it, and it's done in that way. We don't think about it in that bodily sense, and you know, and sometimes I didn't really understand it myself until, like, I have a heart condition. I had the medical people explain how the heart function works, you know, and I'm in a Western doctor's office, a cardiologist explaining this to me. I didn't think until I came into studies that that medical system is also linked to a governmental system. Like, they know that. They know how what the doctors know. They know that if you put individuals into poverty and put them into stress, they're going to have these. So it really is, and to have that, you're either going to run from it, you know, and we know from our communities, I'll use Gabby D. When you started speaking, I thought of Gabriel Dumont in Kingston Road in Galloway. A lot of our families in our community, my family lived there until we moved downtown. And it was very similar like that. You could hear the mice in your walls in that way. And you can't think of, oh, I'm going to go get a better job, or I'm going to go do this. You can't, because you think, and you also think, that is a colonial way of thinking, to think, I can get myself out of this because I put myself in it.
Exactly.
And it's not that way at all.
Exactly. And so it's impossible for us to, not impossible, but it constrains to an incredible degree our abilities then to organize resistance, right, amongst ourselves, also collectively, right, and individually. And that, of course, as you rightly say, that's what the colonial system wants us to do, right, you know, and then wants us also then to struggle with each other over the few crumbs that we have, right, for those kind of those practices of survival. And when I read, you know, Dara Culhane talking about that, right, the way in which then added on to that is that then, as you know, reminded me, Nichole, then we're marked, right, by this medicalizing, colonial medicalizing system, right, that then marks us as for surveillance in terms of how we have so-called mental illness. And I've always struggled with that term, right? Hence the reason why I prefer mental unwellness. But we know that these are the natural outcomes and logical outcomes of you, right? This structure, right? As you read, these are causing us pain because our bodies are trying to flee from that, right?
Yep.
There would be, we would not be human beings at all. We would be objects, even though they want to construct us as objects and things. We would rightly be that if we didn't have, our bodies did not respond in some form or some fashion against that, right? Against that colonial fuckery, right? Right? You know,
I would love to see, sorry, Sandra, but in reading the Panthers 10-point program, I would love to see, like, if I could time travel back and see what their body said to them to get them going to write this, because it tells the story of what's been done to them from that colonizer.
Yeah. And that was primarily put together, you know, obviously, you know, the experiences of both imprisonment and incarceration, both Bobby Seale and Huey Newton as young people, right? Scooped up constantly, right? The movement curtailed, right? So there's no movement possible where, you know, we talk about unable to breathe. Our bodies are unable to move and breathe as whole bodies, right? Without actually somehow breaking the colonial law, right? Being scooped up, right? So, and not just physical, but movement, psychological. So when Huey Newton and Bobby Seale put that 10-point program together in '66, taking up, you know, from where Malcolm leaves off, right? That's defense and self-defense of the collective and the community by any means necessary. It is also, you know, it starts off with, we want freedom. It is also to free ourselves, right, from naturalizing our condition, right, to bring possibilities of self-defense and opposition to this whole structure, and then begin to understand how the structure manipulates us, right, and how the structure operates, right. And before we can understand that, if we cannot understand that, how then can we possibly, you know, resist, right? So I was thinking going back to, you know, the material, going back to Shireen Razak, because I think what Shireen does is, Shireen Razak's work is also to think about these kinds of connections between individual acts and individual experiences, even individual in terms of our communities, experiences as violence, with the whole structure itself. So where you have those two murderers of Pamela George, right? Those white folks, right? Those two white students, privileged white students. Shireen Razak is moving us away then from thinking of them as not just individuals, but that's the way that those two individuals represent the whole colonial structure, right? Just like the two police officers that murdered Byron in that park represent the whole colonial structure and an entire colonial collective identity that sees itself and knows itself can see itself and can only know itself through violence and doing violence to those who have been marked for violence, right? Indigenous folks, right? Black folks, racialized folks. Racialization is a marking process of not the individual, but the entire collectives, right? So I think what Razak is doing is trying to shift us away and think this is not just a couple of individuals. This is the entire structure of power, right? So I throw that out there just to get your thoughts of that, right? And get your thoughts of that story that's being told in Razak, and also, you know, in the follow-on from that, the other article from that, right?
Yeah, because I got lots of thoughts on that stand too, because it really is like, as you were talking and you were talking about those, a lot of us, as you know, I'm a very visual learner, so I get these these visual aspects. So I'm actually, while you're talking, I'm getting these visuals of these two people actually like charging themselves up and embodying that that violent way, and in almost like that almost like a possession, like, you know what I mean, like almost like you have, because
right, yeah,
right. And then so then while we have that, and I thought about that that little colonizer that's in all of our minds, those other beings who have that in there, and how we fight to resist it. And then what that now looks like, say, to those two students who we fight to resist it, but they're drawing it in. And then when you said they know of them, it's a system that knows of itself. And I'm thinking of that opposite of us and how we getting to know ourselves. Like, I didn't get to know myself in relation to the education system until I came in through the TYP program.
Right.
And because, you know, of course I knew I would come through that TYP program because it's designed to be a backdoor for us because we were not supposed to be there.
Yeah.
You know, to have that. So right there, there's that, you know, kind of coming in. And I didn't so I intellectually knew that coming in. But it wasn't until I sat in classes and then that body kind of spoke. And then I feel that violence is going to be done onto me if I don't behave in this classroom and behave the way that the professor wants me to. I remember certain ones, once I got into the bigger university, who have that colonial pedagogy. No, it is always met with violence.
Yes.
So they'll always operate under that violence, even if I have that letter of accessibility in that says, no, your institution says you accept me now and you are supposed to. If you look at it, it says at accessibility, these are recommendations. So I now operated under the ideology that when I came into accessibility services, I talked to the person, these are what is allowed to you based on your needs and what your body needs.
Yeah.
That's what the message is sent to me. But then I carry in to some professors, here's my paper, and it says recommendations. Just that little, so we see how the word recommendation itself is violent.
Yes.
And it's something that I don't even really register because my way of knowing is through the individual. It's the talking to. That's why this meet is great. Even though we're online, I get to see you and I get to talk to you. I get to interact because as we understand, you in particular know, because you helped me in when I was in New 240 to be able to allow my body to freely move without being policed. And it's in the way of, you know, and Audre Lorde speaks about this, the gaze.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just the professors look at me when I want to sit on the floor instead of sitting on the chair. And this is not just me, this is you know, through all of us, where you have professors, you know, such as yourself, who will actually look at me and sit down on the floor too. So then you see that I'm very, when you spoke about that, you brought me to this place of, you know, as the other being that where we're constantly fighting that colonial voice, what then does it say to the one who accepts it and then now comes into policing it, that structure and being that? I think of the Matrix, you know, when the Smith goes in. I don't know if that kind of, if I touched on it good.
Do you say what does that do to the person who is forced to accept that?
Yeah, like, so then you have those two students, you know, that Serena talks about in Pamela's murder, and how embodying that colonial. So now you have those two now. So I wonder, you know, because I'm not that colonial, so I would never take on that knowingly.
Yes.
We do it sometimes unknowingly.
Yeah.
But to take it on, what is that then?
And I think that's where, you know, when we talk about self-defense, self-defense from the standpoint of the historically oppressed, let us say, I mean, I would say that we're all implicated, right? But from the standpoint of the historically oppressed, particularly those who are the most squeezed and the most, whose movements are the most surveilled and policed, right? And the most living in the most violated conditions, right? You know, of colonial violence. That self-defense there then becomes a question of becoming conscious of that relationship of how I, you know, that process of my identifying myself through these colonial ways of thinking that have taught me that the reason how I can know myself is through their thinking, right? And through their tools, which means violence towards and punishment and discipline, right? Towards those. And in my space, perhaps some of us then, we've come to believe in this fight or flight process, right? That the way to bring balance is to become a sort of another sort of slave master, right? On the ranking scale, right? You know, so within our homes, this patriarchal violence we can practice, right? You know, and we can perform a defense against those portions of our bodies that have been hurt and wounded because we consistently amputated ourselves. But we can fill that gap by perhaps being hyper, right? You know, masculinist, right? Or hyper, you know, heterosexualized, right? Or hyper able-bodied, right? You know, and yet, you know, the movement, the process, the beginnings of that, become conscious of that is something that has been externally imposed upon us, right? The beginnings of becoming conscious of that are the beginnings where we begin to start to develop what we talk about as decolonization, right? And anti-colonization, right? And self-defense, right? And I've said this before, I think on our part, right? It is not then a question of actually blame or feeling that we should feel ashamed of that. We should understand that we are, this is our body's natural reaction, right? To the violence that has been imposed upon us, right? And sometimes we'll fall back, right? You know, sometimes we might shout at our children, right? You know, and then we'll regret that, and we'll wonder, we know where that knowledge has come from, right? So we perhaps have to reflect upon that, right? And then have a collective talk about that and a conversation about that. I was thinking when you talked about recommendations, right? That, you know, I was thinking about how, and you talk about those two murders, of where that, those recommendations, you said, you know, that term and qualify that term, right? And called out that term, right? You know, it's also, you know, where those recommendations, Dorothy Hain talks about this, right? Because in this process of the medicalization, there are recommendations that are written onto our bodies of how we should be treated, right? And how our families should be treated. And maybe this becomes, again, part of the colonial agenda. So our families can be scooped up, right? And the state can get hold of our children, right? And kidnap our children, right? You know, and then turn them into little indigenous, black, brown, you know, white bodies, right? You know, that's an imperative by the system, right? An imperative by the state, and they can become ashamed of us, right? And that's where I think you know, and with recommendations, then it becomes, if we take that, we then reappropriate and unpack that language, right? And those concepts, then we begin to, and you mentioned the 10-point program, right? And I've said this before, the 10-point program begins with what we want, right?
Yep.
Right? There it is, there. What we want and what we believe, right? So what we believe then.
Yeah. I know, sorry, I got it too. I printed too.
Our theoretical understanding of our world, right? You know, when we talk about epistemology, knowledge that teaches how we come to know, right? Knowledge that teaches how we come to be, right? What we believe, those are going to be critical to what we want, right? So those recommendations then, if they're anti-colonial recommendations, they're going to be influenced and shaped by those anti-colonial beliefs, right? So, you know, where I'm thinking, right, Nichole, right, that we talk about, you know, the RCMP, Razak talks about the RCMP, right? So those two folks there, those two murderers, right? Those two male, white, you know, heterosexualized, right? They're heterosexualized, right? You know, they have that written on top of them. They have to perform that all the time. Murderers, right? Are then representative of this entire, you know, collective structure called this white settler state, right? So the RCMP, the Northwest Mounted Police, then has known itself as a collective entity by doing violence and raping, right? And forcing into starvation indigenous women. Razak talks about that, right? And now we have, you think about that 300-year-old history, and now we think about just today, we have this RCMP report, right? That's come out talking about the misogyny and the homophobia and the transphobia and the racism embedded in the RCMP. Yeah. You know, and there are recommendations, right? That have come out of this report, and it is all over the news, right? Despite the fact that there's been umpteen reports, right? It is all over the news. The RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lukic, I believe, right? Lukic, yes, the RCMP Commissioner came out today and spoke about this, right? And a lot of pain and a lot of anguish, right? And also speaking about the over 2,000 employees within the RCMP, right? LGBTQ folks, right? Indigenous folks, racialized folks, right? Who have been subjected to this violence, right? And the recommendations are that, you know, there should be then, you know, there needs to be more equity, more diversity, more inclusion, right? And we're going to modernize the institution, right? You know, and it has changed, you know, since I came in, you know, Brenda Lukic, since I came in, and it's been changed. You know, we've started to modernize, we started to transform things over the last couple of years, right? And so this institution that is going to be welcoming for LGBTQ folks, for indigenous folks, for Black folks, for brown folks, for disabled folks, right? And you think, right, you know, because our material that we use, and as we said before, is lived, right? Lives in terms of how we make it useful to a way in which defend ourselves against this oppressiveness, right? This structure, this system, right? And I go back to the park and I think, you know, the two murderers, right, are Byron, Debazege, you know, young man Byron, you know, psychiatric survivor, right, you know, and this is where, you know, Razak is useful because, of course, we know that Byron finds himself on indigenous land right there, which is not supposed to be, right? Indigenous land has been taken over. It has been called this public park. Byron is not public. Many of us are going to these parks are not public. That's why we are surveilled, particularly in groups, right? Constantly,
yeah.
Right?
What is public, right? Yeah.
Right. And just looking to coping mechanism to cope, right? You know, Byron at the time is singing, right? And takes 2 lemons from the store, 2 lemons. And the state, it is not those just two individuals that murders Byron at the time. It is, you know, the state itself. Nobody is bothered by Byron at that time. There's about over 20 witnesses, right? All redacted when you look at the coronary hearings, right? those two murderers, let us understand this, right? If the recommendations are then to have, more training, because that's the report today, more training as well, more equity, diversity, inclusive training. Those folks there are LGBTQ, RCMP officers, Toronto Police Services officers from 53 divisions. If they're Indigenous, if they're Black, if they're brown, if they're racialized, they're gonna still kill and murder, Byron, right? Right?
Yes.
Anyway, and so you're asking for folks to, let's have inclusivity within this violent colonial institution.
This reminds me of, Stan, is remember, when what was I in your community engagement course? And
yes.
I think it was around that time when Bell had that campaign of that wellness, and they were creating mental unwellness for their own employees, and yet have this campaign about let's talk.
Let's talk. Yes.
It's the same thing. It's the same. We're gonna, and oh God, I'm in Chadney's research course right now, and we just had a professor talking about how the colonial system will always reformat itself and reformate. It will never dismantle. It'll always just fix a little bit so that they're out there happy. And that's, and I think about this because I haven't really looked at this report. I know it's today, I'm always a little bit later in the news because I don't have TV at home or access to. So I thought about this. I thought, oh, this is interesting. Just after, what's been going down in the States, what happened with Floyd and how we now calling here in Canada for defunding of the police. Now there's this, Turtle Island call to defund this violent entity. And now all of a sudden now here is this report saying, oh yeah, we're violent. There's this, but we're going to do more training.
Yes. Inclusive colonialism, right? Those violent tools and weapons that colonialism has to keep colonized people in their place, right? And out of our place, to take from, Shreen Razak's piece, right? Can be inclusive, right? And it's essential for them to be inclusive, right? Because, the bodies of the murderers of Pamela, right? They're going to be numerically in the minority, in numerical terms, not power, but numerical terms, right? So what have we got to do? We just got to recruit more, right? Folks, right, in the institution, of colonial violence to carry on the same colonial structure, right? Keep the same status quo in place.
And I can tell you that we've had 2 known officers, one's retired, who are in our First Nation community here in Toronto. And I didn't understand this because I was not a student as yet, but I remember this one officer just, you thought she was a community member because she knew everyone. She'd come to all the powwows. She would always, and she'd invite dancers to dance at police events, and she'd always be there. And she always seemed like one of us, right down to the core. And it wasn't until there was an incident at Gabriel Dumont, the housing complex there, that she had to be a part of. And you saw, no. Yes. And it's not, I saw it for kind of what it is. It's not her now putting on the colonial mask to talk to me as an officer now. She was wearing the mask at the powwow in community space. Because our traditional ways, you cannot inflict violence onto another being living with our teachings, living that Mino Bamatsuin. It makes no room for violence at all. So our Indigenous ways of knowing, the only way we act in a violent way is when we have to self-defend. And sometimes that's just because violence is in our doorstep.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and that's legitimate, right?
That's why I love your piece on blood anger. Oh gosh, I listened to it again. I love it because it's actually allowing your sacred fire within that cleanses, that it's a fire of our lodge. It's what keeps us, sustains our life. So okay, we might not have a traditional lodge where we can have our fire now because we know this land is colonized, to have a sacred fire. Oh gosh, there's this whole protocol around now, what sacred fire is from the colonial.
Yes.
fire department. But we have it within. So even though, okay, out there, the land might not be able to have it right now, it's our job as indigenous bodies from all over the world to carry that sacred fire within. And that means, I still remember saying, I forget what class we were in, and somebody said, oh, you seem angry when you say that. You said, rage. I'm angry. I feed this. This is what sustains my family and my people. And I loved that. Like, it's still a memory in my brain.
It's interesting. It reminds, you know, when we're talking about, you know, indigenous police officer, right? You know, this community policing, right? That they have, you know, we have that in the film by Jennifer Hodge de Silva, right? You know, this community policing, and they're still advocating this, but it's a race-based community policing. They're there to go into the community, right? You know, to terrorize, to create and produce fear, and to close down any movement at all, right? You know, from those who are being policed, those who are marked for surveillance, those who are marked for violence, right? You know, by the state. So those police officers, oftentimes, they're even in the corridors. This is 1983, which apparently, you know, dominant colonial thinking would have us believe is, you know, 20 years ago, before we didn't have this, right? You know, blah, 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 right? Again, that's over 30 years, but it's 300 years, right? And they're in the corridors. They're literally in the corridors, right, of public housing, trying to stop and prevent the movement of folks, right, and to terrorize folks, even within these tiny corridors, right, you know. And as you rightly said, the institution and the culture of the institution does not change. We had a reporter out today talking about this RCMP report, talking about the fact that this idea that it wasn't about this misogyny, this racism, right, you know, this transphobia, right, this homophobia. It wasn't about anything to do with the culture of the institution, right? It was to do with character, which meant individual characteristics, right? As opposed to, you know, the actual culture of the institution itself. And this is where we go back to some of the problems with, and they're still talking about systemic oppression. They'll talk about systemic racism, right? They still have, and they're convinced us about, you know, to swallow this language without actually really beginning to think of what it means, right? Because we can talk about systemic racism, and we can still practice racism, you know, within these institutions. So if we don't talk about institutional racism, the ways in which it doesn't matter whether there are good cops, right, or bad cops. The two officers there, right, who murdered Byron, right? Doesn't matter what they are. When it comes to carding, we had today the RCMP report, Bill Blair, right? Who was the brutal police commissioner, head of the police in Toronto prior to the last one, right? Brought in carding, right? The brutalities in the 2010, the G20 protests, right? You know, if you're carrying out the policies and the rules of the regulations, right, of a racist institution, it doesn't matter how nice you are. You're a racist, right? And that's the importance of having that concept, institutional racism, as well as talking about systemic racism, how that's woven out through the entire system. But what they've done is bamboozled us into moving away from that again, right? And so we start to talk about good cops, and we start to talk about bad cops, and we start to talk about individual training, right? You know,
the thing is, it's crazy because I always think to myself, like, we see it on their cars. They say, like, they wear a uniform, right? Yeah. So that means they're no longer an individual because they're uniformed. You know, they're all the same. You know, when we think about, well, why, you know, how that is on their cars, it's to serve and protect. Well, we never ask ourselves who is the serving and protecting.
Exactly.
We know through our studies that it's Crown interest, and what is Crown interest is the genocide of non-white, right? So we know right there, if we see that now, we have that understanding. We read that cop car much differently than our everyday walking through, and to understand that they have a duty even when their uniform is off. you know, they still have that, and there it is that adapting. But I think also too, when we talk about the, oh, well, it's just the individuals, you know, it's almost like that that curtain, you know, we think of Wizard of the Oz. Oh no, don't look at me. Look at look at these two, you know, to have that. It's also similar to, it's almost like a sacrifice, you know, it's to keep this institution itself intact. There's these bodies, you know, and it's separate, you know, to have that. So this is imperative to understand that there, like you said, there is no good cop, bad cop. The whole system itself, you got to throw the baby out with the bathwater on this one.
Exactly, Nichole. And you take us back, right? Because our materials do this, right? You go what we want, what our beliefs are, right? So fundamentally, the philosophical foundations and the political agenda of policing, these institutions of power. Let's not talk about. We can talk about. We talk about the U.S. context a lot, right? Coming from policing emerges from slave patrols, right? Black bodies on the street, bringing black bodies who are resisting by fleeing the plantation back to the plantation, right? A means and a tool by which to sustain and maintain white supremacist systems of power, in Canadian context, right, as we well know, right, the RCMP Northwest Mounted Police there to sustain and maintain, right, and reproduce the colonial agenda by keeping Indigenous folk in their place, as it's understood by colonial thinking, right, and colonial violence, right. So, and also then to prevent rebellion and resistance, right. And the past laws, right, reserves, right, preventing movement, right, of Indigenous folks, right, an apartheid system to maintain an apartheid system taken up in South Africa as well, right, on the template of our in terms of the Canadian nation state, right, stamping down on rebellions, Louis Riel and the Métis Rebellion, right, this is where the Northwest Mounted Police and the RCMP to come into play, right, come into being, come into existence. And so that identity never, not shifted, not contested, no beginnings to working to dismantle. And so obviously the logic there and the thinking is to keep it in place. And anytime we talk about that, there's a violence coming back in terms of dismissal of our cause, right? And you reminded me, when we think about, I'm going back to the community policing because part of that community policing, right? And you go back to the Jennifer Hodge de Silva, it comes from warfare, right? Yeah. It comes from the ways in which imperial orders, right? Imperial powers, right? Have either, the tools in their basket are to completely and utterly eradicate, the colonized, right? Those who will resist, push out of the way, disappear, kill in mass, or, and this is the flip side, right? This is another incarnation, if you like, right? Another voice, which is, we think about the residential school system, right? And the, turning Indigenous bodies into, as Harold Cardinal said way back in The Unjust Society, little brown white people, right? Into becoming ashamed of one's bodies, our bodies, right? Right? And simply being white people within brown bodies, right? This is in warfare, if it's not complete eradication through bombs, through missiles, through mass murder. We just had that in Australia now, right? Reports of mass murder by Australian troops in Afghanistan. It is through capturing the so-called hearts and minds, right, yes, of the colonized, right? So convincing them, right, of that we're coming here to save and rescue you, right, So then you take up a few of these leaders, you pull out a few leaders, and that they can turn the rest of the community, right, into becoming docile, right, that form of pacification, to pacify, right? It is the pacification means, either we're gonna bomb you, right, or we're gonna change your hearts and minds so you come to see as the saviors, right,
It's interesting you said that, because I'll share something with you, and I haven't shared with my community yet. So this might be controversial, because I'm in a debate right now.
Yeah.
I'm in a debate because there is an influencer in our community who is a fashion designer, Leslie Hampton. She's very popular. She makes beautiful fashion. Serene Fox endorses her. Lots of people in my community that I love and respect deeply are affiliated with this person. Why I take up issue is because if you look on Leslie Hampton's social media, there is an award that is given in Leslie Hampton's name from the Canadian Mining Association. Her father works for the Canadian Mining Association. So now, of course, me, and I'm an active part of our community. I have to say to myself, do I remind everyone, oh, as we have this person understand that her father and her family, who she now proudly lays claim to, is raping our land, is causing man camps, is a part of our MMIWG2S, that this is a horrible, horrible situation. Why are we celebrating this artist? I'm going to get shut down by my community because right now this person is loved. Why? Because they are an avenue for other artists. So now we come to policing now. What does that now look like? And we'll have some people who I know will be like, oh, if I talk to them and they see, they're like, oh yeah, I guess this is problematic. But you get others who, want that colonial stature of being that fashion designer, who will brutally fight.
Yeah, and this is where you going back to Audre Lorde, right? This is the famous, this is where you take up the tools of the colonizer, right? In order to self-actualize, right? In order to defend yourself, right?
Now I have to say, I've met Leslie. She is really a nice person. She really is. But the thing is that when I met Leslie, I did not know that her father was the president of the association, and I did not know that she has an award sponsored by
that
them.
Association.
I didn't know that at the time. So, sometimes I'm like, what is walking a I don't know what to do. So, of course, my spirit, I will speak to it when I get that voice too. When creator says now is the time, like right now, then it's the time. But at the same time too, I love my community so much that I don't want to cause damage. I don't want to hurt other people. I understand that there's artists that want that avenue, but I think, okay, then what am I to do? Should I focus on other avenues that we could go on that isn't that?
Well, it is one example, right? But an example of many, ways in which, the colonial structure, right, inducts us, right, into, becoming complicit in our own oppression, and also the ways in which it forms us in such a way that we only think of our own collective, individual, understanding of what constitutes self-defense, right? As opposed to thinking about implicatedness in in violence that is occurring for other collectives, other communities globally, right? Because these mining communities and our rewards and what we gain from that, right? Going back to the relationship of violence, is also then we become to self-actualize, right? We find our freedom beginning to breathe, right? Again, continuing that process of colonial violence, because it is actually a freedom that is emerging at the expense of the death, right, of collectives and communities and the historically oppressed, right, outside of our space, outside of our sphere. And this is where, with the community policing, is where these peacekeepers come into play, right? Because these peacekeepers, Canadian peacekeepers, go out there merely to safeguard, right, and to clear a space so that the interests of Canadian colonial imperialistic, right, powers, right, can be served, right? You know, we got Barrett Gold right here in the U of T, right? You know, we've got folks, right, who talk about reconciliation, right? The Truth and Reconciliation, you know, Commission, etc., and talking about the recommendations, right, coming from that, right? At the same time, breathing in, even as you live, breathing in the violence and the rape, right, you know, and the destructiveness that is congealed in the spaces that we're at here, and congealed in those kind of partnerships, right, that we are very inextricably linked to, even though we're not aware of them, right, you know, at the time, or even though, you know, we might, you know, not speak to, right, or we might feel that we're opposed to, right, you know. So if we're talking seriously about, you know, all of our relations and interconnectivity, right, it cannot be more than simply speaking about indigenous knowledge outside of colonial violence, right?
Yeah.
Right?
That's why it's the two. That's why with your course what was it? Your community or nonviolence?
Yeah.
What was the title of that course? I love that because it was understanding.
Nonviolence and
there's no such thing as nonviolence. Anytime you deal with the colonial, it's violent, and it's going to do violence onto you as the other being. That's why I love when the Panthers open on this 10-step, when they say, we want freedom. Like, it's not asking, not a recommendation, it's a demand, and it's a we, so it's a collective, and it's a demand, so that means there's an other.
Yes.
That they're making the demand to.
Yes.
So then what is, and if right there you think we want, and then you read that word freedom, to me, that's all I needed to read. I like when I'm like, okay, everything else, steps to it, but that key, because then, you know, if they have to demand to other freedom, that means they are being enslaved. Yes. And they're resisting enslavement.
Yeah, and there's an understanding of that, of course, right? Because I think often most folks, many folks, right, if we look at that straight away, it feels like we're making the demands of the system itself, right? Which is reformism, right? We demand, you know, and you're making requests, right, to your killers, right, to come and meet our needs, right, you know. But it's actually a demand that is not expecting anything from the state, right?
Yeah,
it is
it's
demand
like
it's a demand that says to the collective, these are demands, right? And if you don't give them to us, we're going to take them, and we're going to do them ourselves, right? We're going to work within ourselves. This is about self-determination, right? Yeah. Right? And self-determination, and
it's like having a voice. You know, when we talk about stories, you know, that's why in some of these, sorry, I'd like to go back to the notes, because I'll write, you know, in my notes, I write notes all over. I really looked at these readings and looked at, okay, who's telling the story? What story is allowed? What story isn't allowed? What narrative is being pushed forth? And I love this because it's, you know, in the Heather saying, there is it's a shouting of this story. This is what is going to happen from us that any means necessary. It's very empowering.
So I'm going to go back here, right? Because that's the next section, right? You know, but it's live, right? Because I'm going to go back to Razak, because you reminded me, you know, we know what stories are being allowed, right? Right. Now I've been critical, right? I think I've told this story before, right? I've been critical of those, particularly the piece by Shireen Razak in terms of the murder of Pamela George.
Yes.
And I've been critical because when I was a master's student, right, in Shireen Razak's class, when that came out, when it was published, right, and my visceral response, and I had in that class, it was very small. Those classes are very small, right? You know, about 10 people. And when I came out with this, everybody, the bulk of the folks didn't say anything, which did not mean anything, right? But one colleague that supported me and supported what I was saying was an indigenous comrade, right? And what I said was that I critiqued it heavily, right? And I critiqued Shireen Razak on that heavily, and I'd said basically that you know, you have all of this, you know, and then I was asked, you know, basically asked, well, what do you mean? Explain yourself, right? And at that point, I just had my brother's child had been murdered in Trinidad, and my brother's daughter. And I'd said, one of the things I'd said was, look, you know, if that was about, you know, my family, right? How would you know, right? You threw it out there, right? It was published, but how would you know what are you taking into account there for perhaps somebody like myself showing up into the class and reading about my my family, right? In such a way that does not allow my family and my collective and my community to speak, right? It positions us as victims, right? As voiceless, you know, we're just targets of power, right? You know, power is talked about, right? The white settler state is talked about, right? Colonial violence embedded in these perpetrators, the way in which they've been constructed, and this masculinist colonial ways, right? Where they've traveled from their respectable space into, you know, the degenerate space, so-called, right? You know, criminal space, inferior space, in the stroll, in Regina, right? Where violence can be carried out, where in their imagination, violence routinely occurs, right? And so it can be carried out, right? So this is how you disregard those bodies, right? Because they're there, you don't need to do anything. We don't even need to investigate if they go missing. We don't need to care about it. We don't need to be missing it. You know, Robert Pickton, right? Pickton mass murder, right? I talked about that in the park today. So I said, you know, one of the things I said was, did you ask, you know, did you go back to Pamela George's family, right? You know, for permission to, you know, if they were comfortable with it, right?
Yes.
If they wanted to add anything to it, if it was go or have it, if they were comfortable with having it published. And the response back to me was that, you know, no, I didn't, right? And there was something else that attached to that as well, right? Which I won't say here because, you know, it was, as far as I was concerned, you know, really, you use that term problematic, and it's the only word I can think of right now, but I won't throw it out there right now. But it viscerally, it damaged to me and made me feel then, and made me understand then, that what was happening here was that you were reproducing the invisibilization of Pamela, the visualization of Pamela as, in terms of the collectivity and the community in relation to the indigeneity of Pamela. Even as you look to speak to that, right? And look to try to contest that with these concepts of the racialization of space, you're attaching more power and you're centering more power. You're centering power, you're centering whiteness, and attaching more power and more subjectivity, because we learn more about the two murders. We learn everything about the two murders. We learn about the power, white power structure. But Pamela, we learn nothing about. So you invisibilize Pamela, right? You know, I said, and that, you know, that for me, you're just reproducing the same murderousness, right? You're murdering Pamela, right? Pamela doesn't get to speak. And if Pamela doesn't get to speak, right, you know, this is the flaw. This is the colonialism that's embedded in this framework, where all you talk about, and not just yourself, many others, all you talk about is power. And you talk about then power as it impacts itself on those who are marked for violence, right? Racialization.
It's like a remarking.
Yeah. Yep. And you get caught up in that, right? Even as racialized body, you get caught up in that, right? And you get enthralled by that, and you get excited by that, right? Because you're starting to talk about power and how power operates, right? And meanwhile, every time you do that, you disappear, right? The oppressed, the target of power. You know, just like Culhane talks about your disappearance, right? In terms of all of the layers of humanity, right? Of subjectivity, what makes kinship ties that Culhane talks about, practices, small practices of resistance. You disappear, right?
That's the agenda of the colonial structure. And what I got back was from silence, right? And then I got, there was then a larger conversation about it in other classrooms. Did you think this was so, blah, 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 blah. Some folks also backed me. My indigenous comrade backed me, supported, understood where we're coming from. We all understood where we're coming from, right? And then, you know, I took this up, and I don't know if you remember me saying this. At one time I took this up, right, in classroom, right? And I said, talked about how, you know, Pamela doesn't get to speak. And then I had one member of the class who was actually a TA, right? This is some years ago, right? Saying to me, stood up and said to me, so Stan, how would Pamela get to speak? She's dead. Unbelievably violent response, an unbelievably violent response, right? Somebody who's involved in social justice work, right? A white body, right? To unpack that, to speak to that, to reclaim that is revolutionary self-defense. To oppose that viscerally in everything we can do, right? By any means necessary is self-defense, right? You know, so when we read this stuff, these frameworks, we think of sometimes equity-minded, transformative, revolutionary. It's the colonial structure, right? You know, just kind of tranquilizing us, right? You know.
Well, even Stan, when you said, because I think about, you know, when we were talking about the program name change, right? And we wanted to add critical to the program's name in equity. That got brought in when you were sharing that story of in Rezek's class and bringing that critical lens, because you're actually going, well, wait a second. Now we should, if we had the pedagogy, you know, I love Rezek's work, but in this instance, we would love the pedagogy that was like, oh, wait, you know what? I did miss that. Yeah, I did, you know, to have that, to see, okay, yes, I am recreating this. And that is in that piece, because when I was reading these readings again, I love that, because I liked that reminder of how we can recreate this imperialistic ways of operating and these ways of being without even realizing it. But we depend on the critical lens of our colleagues to see our blind spot. I remember I was in Alex McKay's, one of his last classes that he taught here at INS. And he now talked about the OG Cree word for love. I don't know it off by hand because I didn't do too well in that class. But he talked about the word of love actually meaning, in his dialect, you're back to back. To love means to see the blind spot that your loved one can't have. So you're actually in that moment, it's an act of love from the indigenous way of knowing, because you're seeing a blind spot from this theorist. However, because of that colonized way of being, it's not an act of love, it's a threat.
Yes, there's a pushback, right? And you know, this is where, you know, again, we have to again add complexity, right? You know, to difference, right? Because and going back to, you know, the RCMP, right? The inclusiveness of the colonial structure, right? That's the inclusiveness of the colonial structure right there, right? That reproduces those kinds of frameworks, right? Or masquerading in a sense as social justice, as transformative equity, right? Because it's also a class structure, right? There's an LGBTQ structure, right? It is a you know,
but we have to forget that it
celebrates trans folks, right? It celebrates racialized folks, indigenous folks, black folks, right? Brings folks in, yeah.
But when you say that recruitment, I thought about, well, because I took linguistics for a little while, as you know, and I tried to think, but I learned a lot, but I had to drop the course. And one of the things that has greatly helped me in the equity studies program is understanding the linguistic term of what a reading of a word is. How we can have a word and it can have a reading based on your cultural understanding. So even though we're really reading English, you can have an indigenous way of understanding that word and what it means to you as an other being. So when they say recruit to us as the indigenous body or the othered body, we think, oh, they're recruiting one of us. But to them, they say, no, we're making one of you us. We're recruiting one of yours to our team.
Yeah.
And we have to actively see that all the time.
And you're right. So right, because of course this is also colonial corporate language as well, right? Because when we don't think about recruiting, we're all members, right? Of the collective, right? Right? Which is recruitment into all of our members, right? We're all, our liberation is tied up with one another, right? Right? Mm-hmm. I want to get back to that though. So you talked about that, right? And I think that's, it doesn't mean that we going back, we have to, reject that, those frameworks, but I think we've got to be mindful of the limitations, right? We can hold both, right? We can talk about power, but we got to talk about resistance, right? At the same time. So what do you have any other thoughts on that, right?
What you just said last night in our talk when Ellen said, I loved it. Oh God, I loved Ellen. She's so lovely. Oh my goodness, she's so cute. But when Ellen talked about how we're each doing our own little piece of that greater, to understand like how you said we can hold both, because yes, we can hold this, but there's still work to do over here. So there's other pieces that need to be added to this. I think like maybe as Lego, we're trying to build something beautiful of ourselves. So to be and have that, I have to remind this of myself, especially as an equity study student, that I need to know my part in it, because I'm working with we are a larger collective community. So what is my individual part? And it reminds me of Donis Kennedy is one of our amazing community members. I think Donis Kennedy's out in Alberta right now, but she sings this song that's called Ghost Warriors. I sometimes say whispers. Lovely song, but this talking to, now you see how I have to cite, but in an indigenous way of citing. So we think about what I'm doing now with sharing Donis's story. I'm telling you who it is, just like Pamela, how we have that. So now Donis because she's wonderful. She can share this song much better than me. She says that when she first came to Toronto, she was looking for her people. She's a Native woman, fresh off reserve, coming to this big smoke. She's looking for Native people. She doesn't see any. She feels sad. One day she sees a couple and she sees that they're, being affectionate towards each other. She gets closer and she realizes they're intoxicated and they cannot communicate with her. So she feels very sad because, she sees her people, but she doesn't see them. They're affected by this city, this colonized city. So she puts down her tobacco and this song comes to her, and the song is a calling to the table. So she says, imagine the humanity being a big table and we each have a place at the table. Mm-hmm. And when we get called to our seat, so now I'm in my seat and I might look around and say, oh, there's an empty seat and there's an empty seat and there's an empty seat. And we might know there needs to be work to be done. So we might try and hop in somebody else's seat. But if that person gets called to their seat and somebody's sitting in there doing their work, and we naturally won't do their work because we don't know their work. So we're going to if we now go into somebody else's seat and try to do their work, we're going to make mistakes because that's not our role. When they come to sit down, they can't. So that's where some of our problems can lie in the struggle. So Donis is saying she wants to put that song out to call us all to our seats and to stay in your seats and to understand that even though you see an empty space, it's not your place to fill that, to trust that it will be done and to trust in that out there. So, and I think sometimes, especially us, when we get that, we've been colonized, we have that colonial violence in our bodies, we get anxiety. You helped me that a lot in our classes because there's been a lot of times I've wanted to run from the university, that. Mm-hmm. And it's because of your pedagogy and others like Chadney and Anne and others within this, and Devin Healy, if any of you take her class, right in there, to have this space where my body reacted like, whoa, oh, but then it was because of those pedagogies that are indigenous in ways of knowing, operate in being accepting, to not amputate. that I could actually have little panic attacks and I'm okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
I'm okay. And so my next panic attack isn't so bad because I'm okay. It's still going to be there, but to understand I'm in safe space and to create that and to allow that process of learning in my own body to understand that that's even a step, that that's work that's being done. And I couldn't have done that without you, without other professors in that way. And just to understand that ebb and flow and do our work, like build our fire, but also have that, the vasovagal, that calm, peaceful state to know that we're connected and we always will be. And that we, you know, we're strong in that, and our resistance is beautiful, and that all those good things.
Yeah, you remind me, you know, what was popping up in my mind there was Angela Davis has that, talks about the concept of the intersectionality of struggle, right? And it's important, right? Concept, because when we think about intersectionality, right, you know, many of us are, particularly if we gone through academia in any form of any short term, right, around within the space of social justice, right, you know, intersectionality as concept comes up oftentimes, right, and we think about the intersectionalities in terms of our identities, right, and we have, you know, we experience, you know, multiple and simultaneous oppressions, right, you know, as you know, in terms of race, class, gendered, sexualized, right, abled folks, right? And we carry those multiple identities with us, right? And then we also think about the intersectionalities of then from that our analysis, right? Our analysis of power, which is what we've been doing oftentimes here, right? You know, interjecting, right? And what is being amputated out of from, right? But there's also the intersectionalities, and when I think about intersectionality of struggle, means that, again, going back to, you know, a community and a collective's struggle is tied up with my struggle, right? And we can get caught up, because you reminded me of Ellen, that we can get caught up with our individual, right, you know, struggles, right? Which is what's been happening in the city for decades, right? We have our own collectives and communities, and then we defend those, right? And when we tell folks to come in and say, you know, you can come in to be allies with us, right? But what it suggests is somehow that you're actually not also tied up with liberation either, right?
Yes.
And I always find for me that only reproduces the kind of individualization, right, aspect of neoliberalism, where individuals are competing with each other all the time, right? So we've been pitched against each other for many, many years, right? You know, and I'll always, you know, and it, you know, and pitched against each other. It says that, you know, you stand back, for example, right? I'm not, right? Telling, you know, a dominant body that you have to stay back, right? Stand back, right? Which is what has happened in the more recent past, right? Where, you know, it's for particularly where the oppression is most salient, particularly when it comes to Black folks, right? And anti-Black racism, that I'm, you know, you're white, you stay at the back, you go back, right? I'm trying to figure out how, when we were on the streets, my white mother and I, right? When my father had left to go back to Trinidad, we were on the street sleeping in shop doorways. How then my mother then somehow would have been, you know, would have had to step back, or would have been seen as a body in that moment there of somehow privilege, right? And entitlement, right? It doesn't mean we can't hold that, but we can also hold something else, right? When it comes to organizing. I mean, when we're in public housing estates, public, you know, housing projects, right? There are bodies there, right? That are bodies of difference, right? Folks who are struggling, who are white, right? It is very difficult to say folks who are white, who are struggling without any food to put on the table, that somehow you need to step back, right? That you're privileged and you're entitled. We can separate that from the structure of power, a white structure, as far as I'm concerned, right? But that doesn't do anything for us to organize collectively around a racialized and classed formation, right? Because the white body, my mother there, is racialized as well, was racialized then, right?
Yeah.
didn't experience the same kind of impact as me, right? Visually then, right? But then was racialized because of what was seen as being a degenerate, going back to Razak, expression of what counted as a woman, right? You know, having a child out of wedlock, you know, having a child with a person of color, right? You know, being on the streets, right? You know, you needed to, you know, to be treated or corrected or incarcerated or maybe sterilized, right? Right? You know, that's a racializing process, right? Because it's not just my mother; it's a whole collective of people, a whole group, right? The first place was home was in a so-called home for unmarried mothers, right? A whole collective of people stuffed into this warehouse. So I think we have to think about that, right? It doesn't have to be either or, right? So when we think about these silos and the intersectionality of struggle, I think we also have to think about collectively then how, for many of us, oppression is has particularly salient qualities, right? When we come to anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, has salient qualities, right? What intersectionality can do, also the critique of that is also it can say, well, we all sort of have the, you know, some kind of equality of oppressions, which we don't. We hold that and say, in some cases, right, there may be folks who are able to walk along the street, right, and not be stopped by the police on the basis of their body, even if they are Indigenous, right? Right? Because they don't appear to be the, right, the body that particular police force is seeing at the time as the body which we're waging war on. Black bodies, right? Saskatchewan, Indigenous bodies, the police taking folks out to the tundra, right, in the winter, killing folks, right? Transporting folks, Indigenous folks out to into the wilds, right, to freeze to death, right? You know, that's a saliency to that, right? So let's all get together, right? Let's all understand each other as being tied up in terms of our our liberatory struggle within this colonial structure, and understand that some of our communities, right, are actually being impacted in a particular way, in a very salient way, as George Day would say, right, in any one particular moment, right, and work with that, right? So that intersection. Go ahead, yeah.
Because it does have, I'll share with you, I think I've shared this with you before, Stan, it's a need to have that interest, that being understood. When I went to Grenada with my Caribbean literature professor, just after I graduated from the TYP course, I think at the time it was still a TYP course, I can't remember, but we went to Grenada. Wonderful. I was able to stay because I like to stay locally to get to know the land and the people as Indigenous body. I remember Carla, who we stayed at. Great, wonderful, and we still in contact with their family still up to now. I remember clearly Carla saying to me, I was in her kitchen, and she said to me, you know, Nichole, you know, when the revolution happened here, I was just a young girl. My parents just got married the year prior. I was just a baby. And she said, and she started crying. Like, she put her hands over her mouth a couple of times, and she's like, it's a pain and we haven't healed from it. She goes, you know, my parents, they just sweep it under the rug and just pretend everything's okay. And she says, but us, our children, we know it's been internalized. It's in the way that they discipline us, the fears they have. It's in the way that they relate to one another. It's changed. She goes, look at the bars on our windows. She goes, we never had that before. And she said, she looked at me with this desperate cry on her face. She said, I'm asking this of you because how did your people do it in Canada? And I had to look at her and I said, oh my God, Carla, we have work to do. I said, we got to unpack what this looks like. And I just started crying, and we just cried in that moment, but it was stopped short because her dad, because she rented the two houses, as you know, in the Caribbean, some of the houses are close together, right? So this was one that had the two houses right next to each other. And her dad, after checking the neighbor to see how they were doing, you know, because as you know, they'll come just to see how you're doing. Do you need anything? How's everything going? You know, do you want to have a tea? Do you want to sit and talk for a little bit? So he comes over and he's like, hey, Nichole, how you doing? Her dad comes along and quickly, boom, there goes the tears under the carpet. And she goes, we'll talk about this later. And so now we're two different. I don't understand the Grenadian struggle. I am not Grenadian, but I can understand it to a point, to a level that we now can open up conversation and we can do a collective, okay, we can go through this. And maybe there's things I know for a fact, not maybe, I know for a fact that if we did this work and unpacked what this looked like, say just Carla and I, just us two in those moments, just our personal, what it's done to us and what we've experienced, there's so much I'm going to learn, and there's so much that she's going to learn. And then that could, so if we think about what those possibilities look like when we can see what, that other side of it, of how we can understand ourselves.
I hear in my body, going, what you're saying, Nichole, and going back to thinking about that concept of the intersectionality of struggle and resistance, and thinking about the connections with land, right? Because of course, when we talk about intersectionality, right, in the way intersectionality has been taken up is merely about individual embodied resistance in a very surface way, right? That doesn't have then connections to our bodies with land, right? And I'm reminded, when, sometime there was a conference years ago, and there was this, it was a conference that was focused on violence against women, right? And it was largely a conference which populated by, racialized women, right? Black women, right? Disabled women, right? All historically oppressed, right? Coming together within and thinking about the feminist struggle, right? Transformative feminist struggle. And so they used this concept of intersectionality because people kept saying, well, what about me, right? You haven't experienced what I've experienced, right? Well, you haven't experienced what I've experienced. Look at me, when I go out, right? You don't know what it's like, right? You don't even know basically what it's like also to, and rightly so, right? In some instances, you don't know what it's like to, have to be afraid when your loved ones go out on the weekend, right? And you're afraid, and your heart is in your mouth, that you only feel safe, and you only feel at ease when they come back through the door, right? And another instance where I think, I recall one instance where disabled scholar was talking about mobility, right? And mobility within the constraints on mobility using in terms of a wheelchair, right? What that meant, right? Mobility device. And then on top of that, then confronted with, the concept of mobility, what it means that to move, right? Around within a black, able-bodied, but black and indigenous body, right? Right? What it means in terms of being put into spaces where you are, forced to serve, right? The dominant, right? Forced to travel on buses, right? I'll take it a little in terms of the moment, right? At 5 o'clock in the morning on these COVID-ridden buses, right? Because those are the only forms of employment, right? That this colonial structure allows you to take up, right? Because of your difference, right? So some of that stuff was going around, right? And so the way in which they got around this, right? This competing, right? And to create a sort of collective struggle, right? A collectivity around struggle, was to bring in intersectionality and talk about, well, some of us have, privilege, right? In one particular instance, in one particular moment, right? And some of us have, have experiences of oppression, right? And our privileges are related to your experiences of oppression, right? And it was called out, right? Because what we were doing was everybody then had experiences of oppression, and everybody had privilege, et cetera, right? And it was called out, and it was called out as being so-called problematic, right? Right? By the one indigenous body there who said, look, yeah, but I'm the only indigenous body here. I'm the only indigenous woman here. And basically all of you, right, have no consciousness of your connections to land, right?
So you're forming your frameworks and thinking wrapped around resistance and your frameworks of how we come together collectively in order to unite against oppression. But you're also abstracting and amputating, right, the land from your bodies, right, you know, and so you're amputating me. So if I don't have a place in here, right, I don't have a place in that space, right. Yes. So there's some moments there where we think about, wait a minute, okay, we can hold all that, but we can also hold the fact that, you know, sometimes our oppressions are not always equal, right, you know, our experiences. And so I was thinking about, you know, struggle, right, and intersectionality of struggle. So what we've been talking about is that intersectionality, right, of knowledge and of frameworks of knowledge, right, where we see our bodies and our experiences, right, tied up, right, with also land, right. And how you and I have talked about this in terms of, you mentioned TYP, and we talked about how when we think about land, you know, we think also then about these historical buildings here. And I think you also mentioned it in the park, right, where I was at today, right, of some of the buildings there, of how, you know, that embedded and congealed in that brickwork, right, is blood. It's the blood of Black folks on the plantation systems in the Caribbean, right? My own ancestors in Barbados, right? It is also the blood of the strugglers that are involved in that, right? My folks from St. Vincent, right? The connection there, the collaboration there between Kalinago peoples and African peoples, right? You know, formed the struggle. It actually pushed out, right, colonizers out of St. Vincent, right? And so, you know, I guess, you know, you think about that then, and you think about that then building on top of indigenous land, and you think about that blood that goes in there and that blood that comes back into the buildings, that memory, right? Because we think about concrete as if it's somehow not, it's separate from land, but our memories and our bodies and our resistance struggles are congealed in that. So even to grasp, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, to take up those kind of frameworks of being, right, is self-defense, right? But it's also an intersectionality of thought, right? It takes intersectionality and what we think about intersectionality of struggle on a different level, in a different plane, right? In a different space, right? And I think that's what we've got to think about, because a brick is not just a brick, right? The bricks that go into, that are talked about in, you know, in TYP, or the buildings, the historical buildings that you talk about, that you mentioned, right, Nichole, in our exchange, right, in the park there, right?
Yeah, being one of the houses having a parliament brick from like 19.
Brick, your parliament brick. Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
I was like, so they took a parliament building that got burnt down and thought, you know what, we can't waste these bricks. You know, you think about that way of thinking, we're going to now build it, use these bricks from the parliament building that's made for genocide, and now put it now in this new building. So what does now that build? Yeah,
exactly, right?
It's great. Yeah. And then to see, like, one other thing when you were talking about,
what I would just add before I forget, you hold that thought, right? Before, because my brain tends to run off, right? Going back to the point about, you know, the person in that classroom who said, well, how does Pamela speak because she's dead, right? This means that when we think about producing and drawing and reclaiming our own knowledges, right, in terms of how we resist, how we come to be, how we defend, and where we're going, right, means we have to have an alternative, an oppositional understanding of what constitutes death, right? Because our folks are not dying, right? Our folks are with us, they're in our bodies, and they're with everything around us, right? And everything around us and all that collectivity is all a part of living, right? It's all part of being. It may well be in a different form, a different space, but it's speaking back to us, right? Right.
Well, is it funny that you mentioned this, because I actually think of like a literal death. As you know, recently, my family in particular, we have lost my Uncle Rick. He's the oldest child of my grandmother, who I was raised with, Catherine Martel. She's a Wendat woman from the Ottawa Valley area, and she came here after residential school and meeting my grandfather. Now, what we didn't know all this time, my uncle, I just knew my uncle as, you know, we don't operate under the medical terms of mental like health and all of that. I just knew that my uncle was somebody who needed more time to process it.
Yeah.
My uncle is somebody who's a very traditional man. He does not believe in paying rent. He does not believe in buying food because they're birthrights onto us, every being. So his living was resistance. So he is not paying for rent. He is not doing these things, and he's not doing that. So now my uncle has passed. And also too, we found out later on in life, like later on now, my family, we found out through an aunt of ours that the reason why my uncle had what I guess could have been diagnosed as a mental health thing was actually ill birth practice of the colonizer onto my grandmother. She wanted to practice her traditional ways of birthing. They were enforced. My uncle had complications at birth. Now, when it comes to him passing, what we want is him to go back to the land, because he's now going to go back home, back to the cycle of life. He's now going to be a part of the trees, the grass, Mother Earth herself, to become what colonizers dig for is like oil, like he's going to decompose and be a part of, you know, the life cycle. And that's our natural way of being. Well, if we don't have money, they won't give us him. Yeah. Yeah. Right now, my uncle, they're going to burn him, and they're going to take him over to unclaimed bodies, they say. And now he has to stay there. So, you know, his death to me was done at his birth. Yes, exactly. So death to me doesn't mean like, it takes up a different, well, what does death really mean now?
Yeah. I mean, I was talking today, trying to talk today about mourning, right? Because that also affects colonialism's understanding about death, right? And how it treats death, you know, and how it treats its own, right? Death, right?
Yeah.
But it's somehow that's it's finite. And then if we take up colonialism literally, he wants us to talk about, you know, going to some other place, right? With this white guy with a long beard, etc., right? You know, in so-called heaven or something like that, right? So I was talking about, you know, mourning then. And I was thinking about mourning for, you know, members of my family, right? As you also know, we're fragmented, right? And we haven't been able to get anywhere, right? You know, and you know, I've got in mind, I once had the idea of putting my mother's false teeth and burying it in close by that park, in the cemetery close by, next to Mackenzie King, right, the racist former PM, next to his grave, right? You know, the act of, so I could be close to my mother, but also an act, right? But it's also beyond that. I understand that there's a necessity for me to also have that physicality, tactile aspect, and I've clung to that, right? It took me a long time to think, no, there's also, I have to have another way. I have to reclaim another way of mourning, another way of living with my own ancestors, my family, right? In such a way that doesn't cut them off once you die, right? So we've always had a connectedness, you know, in blood anger. There's always connected with a part of our bodies, a part of our body that goes back to land, right? You know, there's a memory there, you know, and it's not just there in land, it's also then in our bodies. So we're reclaiming the memory of our bodies, right? And so then nothing can die, right? You know, those knowledges can't die. They're constantly with us. So it is interesting that, not interesting, it is a logical effect that our struggles with death and with oppression are constantly with death and dying, right? We're constantly with navigating death and dying, and looking to attempt to exercise defense against those members of us who have left this world, right? You know, the Panthers. You went back to the Panthers before. You know, everything about the Panthers is about death and dying, right? Life and death, right? In ways that suggested that our bodies, right, are committed to a struggle, and they may not be here. They're not going to be here for long, and they may be taken. But somehow our bodies and the knowledge that our bodies carry and our bodies accumulate, transformative, revolutionary knowledges, it's that which then passes on, right?
It's that which then embedded, you know, into our collective struggles that go on. So when you talk then, Nichole, right, about those knowledges, right, that, you know, of your uncle, right, you know, that then becomes embedded in you, and it's coming to me now as well. So that knowledge, that's our embodiment alive, right? You know,
Yes.
And I think, and they can't take that away, right? I have a little piece, you know, in when we go into the Panthers about Fred Hampton. It's Fred Hampton who says, you know, they can kill the revolutionary, but they can't kill the revolution. And then Fred had changed it, right, because of the, you know, the means of incarceration weapon that these colonial systems have, right, of scooping everybody up, right, who are a threat. You know, you can jail the revolutionary, but you can't jail the revolution, right?
Yes,
you know?
yes.
Whatever they do, right? Whatever they can't take that away, right? They can't kill your uncle, right? That knowledge passes on to us, and it will remain in you. And now it's transformed to us and anybody who listens to that. So, you know, I go, and it reminds me then of, you know, that the Doyle-Wood piece, right? And then here we were talking about resistance, right? We have end up putting Pamela back and centering Pamela, right? You know, how can Pamela, you know, speak because Pamela's dead? You know, we don't die. We have to understand we have different conceptualizations of what it means to live and what it means to die, right? The Doyle-Wood piece is the Valentine's Day Memorial March. Well, you know,
which is now our Sisters in Spirit, right? Every February 14th, which is also my daughter Indiana's birthday, we gather and we celebrate our sisters in spirit, and that is so the, you know, when we talk of, when you say that, yeah, what we understand as death is so different. Like there is, you know, and it's something that the community really, it now doesn't. Yes, of course, there is that sisters in spirit where we have that somber, like, no, that sadness that we've lost our sisters, and we continue to.
Yes.
But there's also a gathering of sisters.
Yes.
When at one point, as we know, was illegal on our own land. So we have that, and it just, there's that gathering and that celebration and all of that, and speaking their names, you know. So yeah, when that student, you know, asked that question, yeah, that's
and you're and there's a taking up of space and a taking back of space and a reclaiming of space, right?
Yep.
You know,
and it's done at the police headquarters every year. In Toronto.
That I reminded of Doyle-Wood, you know, in downtown East Side Vancouver. There, you know, that action, right? You know, that voice, the collective voice of reclaiming the sacred, right? You know, because we're not allowed to be viewed. We're not, racialization as a marking process for murder. Murder is at the level of the psychological, the emotional, the physical, right? You know, our knowledges are murdered, right? We then are denied sacredness. Our bodies are denied sacredness. I talked about 9/11 and how even the dust earlier was considered to be sacred, because primarily, even though there was racialized bodies in there, it was primarily seen as an attack on whiteness and white bodies, right? And white embodiment, right? And even the dust was seen as sacred. So when folks, these police officers went to the Picton farm, right? They're talking about and shedding tears over the state of and the conditions of animals, right? Of pigs and sows, right? You know, without honoring the sacredness of those precious bodies, right? You know, that are in that ground, in the, you know. So when with Culhane, when I think of that, going to spaces such as alleyways and parks, right? You know, and dumpster trucks, right? Well, precious loved ones' lives have been taken by the state, right? And then honoring, returning back that sacredness and that subjectivity, and honoring names, as you said, naming, right? Sister of, mother of, aunt of, right? You know, if that's not an act of revolutionary self-defense, right? And an act of revolutionary self-defense in terms of, you know, you talked about your uncle before, as your uncle was born, before your uncle was born, before our ancestors are born, before our folks are born, they're already marked, right?
Yeah.
If that's not an act, going back to Culhane's point and going back to the memorial marches, Valentine's memorial marches, and taking up that space and reclaiming that space, just like the park, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Oriole Park, Byron Devasa Gay Memorial Park, should we say? We don't need them to name it. We can name it ourselves and call it ourselves, right? Just as the Panthers named Little Bobby Hutton Park in California, right? One of the first Panthers been murdered by the state, 17 years of age. If that's not an act of self-defense in terms of, defending the 7 generations that move on, our children and their children and their children, right? Defending them from hopelessness and helplessness, right? Defending themselves against colonial understanding of what counts as sacred, right? I don't know what is, right?
And we know already that from the residential school systems and all of those things, that how a lot of us have lost the name. So we see there's like, so there's not just a saying of their name as like bringing back that spirit and honoring that spirit, but also to reclaim your name. Exactly. Because it is taken from you. Like I know my Nan Martel was not her name that she knew. She didn't even understand like a last name. Like, she didn't understand all of those things. And it's interesting to see how a lot of the time now our communities are recognized by last name, which are renamed last name. So you see some of us who actually reclaim it, who actually don't even have their, and we know too from our youth, like Nazarene, she's in Regent a lot, and she's brought some of her friends here, and the first thing they say to me is, okay, don't tell anybody, my government name, my govy name. So now I know their street name and I know their govy name, right? So because I have a different respect as a mother of their friend, that not only I'm not just going to know their street name that their friends know them as, I'm also going to know I'm going to know more about them because I'm being held in a certain regard. And we know that the police and that propaganda that is put onto Regent Park themselves, that these youth are disrespectful and unruly. But I can just have an example of how much respect I automatically get just by the nature of being a mother. I'm just a mother and I have respect in that way. And so I like the naming and calling out a name has so much to it, and we know that in just the languages, like the English language compared to indigenous languages from all over, what that looks like.
And calling out the name in such a way that there's a link between the land itself, our embodiment, and the cosmos, right?
Yes.
And everything around it. That I think one of the things that I probably didn't mention, and I think folks who are listening, when we go back to Jennifer Hodge, right? Jennifer Hodge's Silver Home Feeling, right? Going back to Razak, because what we're talking about here is lived self-defense, right? These are self-defense practices, self-defense knowledges, right? That again this is life and death issues here. This is no academic exercises we're talking about here. In what Jennifer Hodge de Silva talks about there is also not only the police that are coming in on public housing, right? Ontario public housing units there, but also you reminded me also the collective organizing that is occurring from renters there, right? Racialized renters there who have an analysis of power, right? It's not academics, not the university, nothing. The folks there gathered together, right? Have an analysis of power, right? An analysis of how folks are being policed, right? And surveilled, right? And contained, right? Movements contained, right? And organizing, even within that particular space of oppression, right? Organizing collectively to oppose, right? To resist, right? To speak, to live, right? To breathe, right? fundamental, right? You know, and breathes life right into us, right?
Mm-hmm. And we see the threat, because as you were talking about that, you know, the image that was held in my head as you spoke about, you know, you spoke about this and painted this picture in my mind is of Angela Davis in that Bulletproof Glass speaking. You know, we know how much of a threat that organization and that analysis can be.
Yeah, it's the analysis, right? This is what I think fundamentally, folks, I think, I say, when I say folks, I'm not talking about our class, right? I'm talking our class are brilliant, right? I'm talking about, you know, the dominant understanding, right? And even those who want to claw back and reclaim, you know, Panther thinking, right? And the movement itself, is that analysis, it's that analysis that is so dangerous, right? The education systems that are so dangerous. Bringing that analysis to the classroom with young children, right, is revolutionary and therefore threatening and frightening to the system itself. And still to this day, right? And I will say this, you know, you can have in DC, you know, they have Black Lives Matter, right? Boulevard. But there's still a struggle to have a street named after Fred Hampton, right? In Chicago. Fred Hampton Jr. has been trying to do that for some years, right? And the police still say that, oh, well, no, we can't have a cop killer, right? You know, so reproducing the same, you know, racist, right? You know, colonial sort of mocking, right? You know, and convincing people to do this. When, of course, what Fred was talking about, what was threatening about Fred, and also Bobby Lee in Chicago, was that they were the first ones to emerge and bring together what both Fred Hampton and Bobby Lee, right, section leader, called the Rainbow Coalition. So they were bringing white folks together. They were poor white folks together. They were bringing Puerto Ricans together, the young lords, right? They were bringing black folks together in Southside Chicago, right? Anybody that came, right? They're bringing LGBTQ folks together, right? You know, they were bringing disabled folks together. You know, they were called, what did they call it? The Uptown Coalition. So all the folks were uptown. Everybody was coming together, right? And that was threatening, right? That was damning, right? You know, and it was the structure, the overturning and the dismantling of the structure, right? That was fundamentally threatening, right? Which is where we're at now. But we have to be careful making some comparisons, right? Because there was a war of extermination waged upon the Panthers and Panther thinking, right? So we have to be aware, right, that we're involved in a war, right?
Yes.
And work for that. That's why all of these aspects, everything we talk about now, right, is fundamental. I've got it you'll have seen it in the video. Our folks will have seen it. The first piece by Fred Hampton in that next section, right, is about Fred Hampton talking about that you have to have a revolutionary theory before you start your action, right?
Yes.
Right, because that's going to influence your action. If you don't have that revolutionary theory in mind, that education firmly grasped, right, then it's going to influence your action, and your actions then are going to keep that structure in play, right? Going to pitch us against each other, right? And we're going to say, fuck that, right? We're not having that. We fucking reject that.
And that right there, that key piece, you know, is so pivotal.
Yeah.
It's so pivotal, that piece right there. Yeah.
So on that note, we have gone on now. I think we went on for 2 hours. Now we have the task. I'm hoping that this is going to be, we're going to work with it, be able to upload this, or it's going to work out fine. I did one long one at the beginning of all the classes where I went on for 2 hours and it shut down on me. I didn't realize it wasn't recording. That was on my iPad, right? My storage had been, overloaded.
iCloud's like, hey.
Try to run downtown, right, and deal with that and then come back again, right? there'll be things that we haven't touched upon, you know, and what I was hoping we'd do would be to tell our own stories and weave through the material that we put on the course, and our colleagues and our comrades in our, you know, who are watching this in our class, right? They are our comrades, right? You know, this is what we fundamentally reclaim those terms, right? Also have their own stories, right? That are now are politicized, right? In the service of self-defense, right?
I loved your assignments when I read them. I love them because they all are centering the self. You know how when you do the reflections, you would say use the readings as your lens, see through them. It's now you're the lens. That's awesome. And you get to see, okay, how now then are these readings now working with you?
Exactly, right? Working with you and working for you, right?
So it's not like that. It's actually a two-way street, like not a two-way street because they're separate.
Yeah.
But like a pull and pulley.
And reclaiming that, right?
Yeah.
It's also is part of the self-defensive struggle. And the self-defensive struggle, we're talking about freedom and liberation, right? Every time our bodies do that, right? You know, we bring in joy, right? We're bringing spirituality back to our bodies, right? You know, we're taking political and revolutionary care of our bodies as individuals that are inseparable from our collectives and everything around us, right? You know, and you and I, when we talk, our knowledges are all constantly intertwined, right? You know, because of course we are not only interconnected, we're interrelational, right? You know.
Well, that's it. You know,
multiple levels. Right?
Because I say this, you know, and it's such a true thing. I remember the day I was at the TYP orientation, and so we had to pick our elective, our arts and science for the TYP course. And I remember already looking through them and thinking sociology by description. And then the door opened to my left. And I always sit at the back because I'm a visual note taker and I need to see. So then this way, when our comrades in class talk, I got to see them too, because they're just as important as the professor, what they bring into the classroom. So, and I knew that then. And I remember looking over and seeing you, watching you watch the building. So you were looking at the structure, you were looking at the seats, you were looking at the space around, and it was the familiarity of you reminded me of my uncles, especially my Uncle Tim. My Uncle Tim will do that. My Uncle Tim is one who's all about, you got to see the background first, Nichole. Everybody sees what's right there. You got to look behind. And he trained me as a youth to always see the details that nobody pays attention to. So he would do that. And so when we go into spaces, he had a different lens than other people. You reminded me of that. And then you read Yo Yes. And I was like, that's it. And I actually remember before then I thought, okay, this is a big chunk I'm going to take. I'm going to take this university. And the reason why I went into U of T is because my cousin told me I wasn't smart enough to be at U of T. So it was already a challenge. So then I thought I have to fight now to get in. But after you read Yo Yes, and I was like, no, I'm taking equity studies. And I thought afterwards, and I thought, I'll know this stuff because this is like my life.
Yeah.
And then I remember June Larkin in the first course in the intro. And I remember going to my family, I get to talk about this stuff. And to my community, you know, I get to talk about oppression. I get to talk about the colonizer in class. And I can talk about my personal experience and they hear me. That in itself was family.
Yeah.
And it's real. Like it's 100% like, so to all those you students there, you know, in the equity, you picked a good. I'm very proud because we are like a family, because I literally, as you know, I have to pick my professors. So I have to, you know, I just met another one, but it was in the Women and Gender Studies program. Sunny Hoot, I don't know how, DHOOT. Beautiful pedagogy. Oh my gosh. So now next term, Sunny, what do you take? Are you teaching something I haven't taken? Channy, are you taking something? And Stan, you. And I've actually talked to Bonnie about this and she's talked about this and supports, okay, you know what? I'll help you. It's a family. And that in itself is, I don't like to say that decolonizing, it's indigenizing.
Yeah. And I would say add to that, decolonizing and anti-colonizing at the same time, because we're fighting, right? We're gonna fight back. And you know, when you mentioned family, yes, you know, the essence is that we defend our families, right? So we have a political consciousness of what constitutes family, community. We have an obligation and responsibility to defend, right? So I wanna thank you, Nichole, from the bottom of my heart for coming in. This has been wonderful for me because I've also missed you, right? I've missed the classroom, our conversations, and your incredible revolutionary input, right? And so I will say miigwech, right?
And much love to all your students.
Much love.
Normally I get to see, like, not, I should say this year's new 240s, the new ones coming in. Like now we get to see who our new family is. So I miss that piece, but they'll get to see me. So I hope, you know, I love you. We're family now. I love you. Find me on social media. We'll be a family.
Much love and much respect to you, Nichole. Okay, so we'll finish it here, right? Okay. And we'll hope and you know that we pray to the Creator that this recording turns out well. So you will.
I'll stop it now.